Today I'm going to be showing you how to create a value scale using tempera paint. We want to make sure that we have a nice high range of value in our value scale, like you see in the example here. So it goes from the lightest value, which is white, all the way out through all of these tints to our pure hue of red, and then out to a very dark shade of red. Now, you can choose to do this in any hue that you like. The hue is just the pure color off the color wheel. And from there, you're going to mix multiple tints and shades. So we're going to start out by getting a foam palette or tray. I have on here purple or violet, which is my pure hue. And I have some white to mix my tints, and a little tiny bit of black to mix my shades. Now, I accidentally poured myself a little bit too much white. You really only need about this much, so about the size of 2 quarters. So in part 1 of the video, you drew your silhouette in the middle, and you made yourself at least 7 steps for your value scale. You want to have at least 7 steps so that you can have a nice high range of value. And you want to make sure you have a lot of contrast between your first step and your last step. And you want to have enough contrast between each step that you can see the difference. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by painting my lightest tint, which is just going to be pure white. So I'm just taking my white right off the palette and I'm going to paint this. Now, when I do this, I want to make sure that I don't have too much paint on my brush and that I'm just doing a nice thin layer. You can always do a second coat if you need to, and I'm doing my best to stay inside my lines. Just kind of smooth it on there. Now, I would be painting all the way around the cupcake, doing this whole first step here. But because I don't want you to have to watch a 30-minute video, I'm only going to be doing a small section for each value. So now that I've painted my first step, which is pure white, I'm going to be adding a tiny bit of violet to my white to create my first tint. So, going to put a little violet here, and I'm going to pull some white into that. So if you notice, when I got my paints, I put them in the corners. You always want to do that so that you have the middle for mixing. Now I think I actually want to add a little bit more white to this because I want this to be a super light value. Let's see if we can see the difference. So see how light that violet is? It's like a super light lilac color. Now you'll notice that when I'm putting the paint on the brush, I'm never touching the metal of it. You don't want to have the paint globbed on there like this, because it's really hard to control it once you get that much paint on there. So let's make sure that we don't do that. That also can make the brushes get kind of gross. Okay, so like I said, I would paint all the way around here for my first step. Now, all that I'm going to do to create my next value is I'm going to get a little bit of purple. You can actually wipe a little excess off and just mix it in. Now you want to make sure that you mix that value evenly. You don't want to have streaks of white or violet in there. And then you can kind of hold it up to your last value to see if there's enough contrast between us. I'm finding there's not quite enough, so I'm going to pull a tiny bit more violet in there. I'd say that's enough contrast now. So you always want to check it and make sure there's enough contrast between there. Okay, so remember, like I'm doing nice thin coats. I'm staying in my lines. All right. Now my next thing that I want to do is I want to, actually, you know what, now that I'm looking at that, I'm kind of finding that it's a little bit too much of a jump. So I'm going to pull a little bit more white back in there. And you're going to find that this is going to happen sometimes. If you start painting a small area and you notice there's too much of a jump, just go back in and adjust it. I think that that's much better. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to add a little bit more violet. Okay, so every time I'm adding this, so this kind of a project, the value scale, is really just teaching you how to create a high range of value in your artwork. So it teaches you how to mix the values and then also to get your eyeballs sensitive to value. The more sensitive you are to value, the easier it is to shade things from observation. You can really start to take your art to another level once you can do that, because you can really create artwork that's a lot more realistic. Now there is not enough contrast there. I'm definitely going to add more violet. So you'll notice even when I'm doing this, I'm constantly having to check my contrast between my values. If you don't have enough contrast, it winds up just looking like the same thing. We don't want to have that. That's especially important if you're creating any kind of like a shaded drawing. You want to have contrast between values. Otherwise, it'll just look like a blob in certain areas. Okay, now I'm going to add some violet with just a little bit of white here, because what I want to do now is start to create kind of the darker ends of my tints. So this is probably like, actually let's get a little more in there. This is probably like 80% hue or 90% hue and like 10% white. Because my next step, I want to have that be my pure hue. Okay, so now that I've created all of my tints in there, I'm going to wash my brush over here, really thoroughly dry it, and then I'm just going to take my violet, and this I'm going to paint just straight up violet, so this is my pure hue. Now I don't want to get paint on my iPad stand, so I'm not going to go to the edge there. But when you do this, you're going to go all the way around these values. Now you'll notice sometimes with the pure hue, it's not as opaque, so it's a little see-through. If that happens, just let it dry a little and do a second coat. But always let it dry first, otherwise you're just pushing the paint around. Now that I have my pure hue, I'm going to pull some violet aside, get the tiniest bit of black, so you want to get some black and kind of rub the excess off over here, and then mix it into your violet. You'll get a nice dark shade. So the black paint is not as opaque as the white paint. So for a color, a shade like this, you might actually want to do 2 coats. Now just like with the white, just add a little more every time. So now I'm adding a little bit more black. So every time I want it to get darker, so that I have enough contrast. Go all the way up here. So this is almost black. And then I can actually have my last shade be just pure black. And I'm going to pick this up so that I don't wind up getting it on my iPad stand. Okay, like that. Now this would go all the way around. So this is just a quick example of how to create the value steps in your value scale. The last step you would do is make sure your brush is nice and clean with your plain black paint. You're going to then paint your silhouette in the center. Always do this last and make sure that your first step is dry, because if you have black paint kind of mixing with that first value, you're going to wind up getting gray streaks in your silhouette. And we don't want that. We want this to be a really nice, solid image. You'll notice that I'm actually kind of outlining the image first around the edge so I get a nice sharp line, and then I'm painting inside. So I would paint the whole inside of the cupcake until I had a nice dark silhouette like this. Best of luck.